Hello and welcome to Fast Forward Newsline. My name is David Kattenberg. Today on Fast Forward, climate change. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has just met with provincial premiers in Vancouver last week for a first discussion on a national energy strategy. At the top of a list of contentious issues, putting a price on carbon. With me to talk about this today is Sara Arenson. Sara is a Winnipeg-based journalist and writer. Thank you for joining me again, Sara.
Thanks for having me today, Dave.
Putting a price on carbon, Sara, what does this mean exactly? We're hearing about carbon taxes, we're hearing about cap and trade. What do we mean by putting a price on carbon?
Okay, well, when you're talking about greenhouse gases that are causing climate change, basically these are mostly gases that contain carbon, and carbon is the pollutant that's being released into the atmosphere. So the idea is that you want to put a price on pollution. Pollution normally affects people that are far away from the people that actually do the polluting. And the people that do the polluting have to be paying for it.
And climate change is already bringing about incurring enormous costs to society globally. And the idea is that if you're going to be putting carbon into the atmosphere and it's a greenhouse gas, then you've got to pay for the cost.
Well, exactly, because it's not covered in the cost of extracting, say, the fossil fuels. It's not covered in the cost of producing things. It's going up into the atmosphere, and then it's causing damage to everybody, to the whole planet. And that's what economists call an externality, something that's affected, that's external to the market exchange. So by putting a price on carbon, what you're doing is you're telling people, if you're going to pollute, you're going to have to pay for X amount of pollution. And in the case of carbon pricing, you're talking about per ton of carbon. How much is it going to cost you to release that into the atmosphere?
So up until now, gentlemen who I spoke with, Andrew Weaver, who's a well-known climatologist, climate modeler in British Columbia, and also the head of the Green Party out there, as it happens, has said that up till now, the atmosphere has been a dumping ground for people's pollution, not just carbon, but pollution of all sorts, and it's absolutely free.
Yeah, exactly. Same thing with the oceans. If you look at, there's a classic theory by Gerard Hardin called A Tragedy of the Commons. Maybe you've heard of that. If you have a whole bunch of people and you have a shared space and they're all able to use that space and they each benefit individually, let's say, in this case, it was a pasture he was talking about. Every single person, a shepherd, can add an extra sheep to the herd, and it benefits that shepherd, but the overgrazing is going to affect the entire pasture, and everyone's going to lose. But under that model, if nobody pays, nobody considers the effects on the aggregate, on everybody, everyone's just going to keep continually adding a sheep to their herd until it gets completely overgrazed. And it's the exact same principle when it comes to carbon. We're just going to keep putting carbon into the atmosphere because the individual companies are benefiting.
And this was what Garrett Hardin referred to as the tragedy of the commons.
Yeah, exactly. It's a classic idea.
Tell me, what is a carbon tax?
Well, a carbon tax is one way of putting a price on carbon. There's actually two ways of doing it: carbon tax and cap and trade. Carbon tax is basically just making people pay for how much carbon they release. So it might, for example, be like for every ton of carbon you release into the atmosphere, you're going to pay $15. And that's actually what Justin Trudeau is trying to do. He's trying to establish a minimum price on carbon, because right now it's free. It's free to release carbon.
And we've got carbon taxes in British Columbia and developing one in Alberta. In British Columbia, they're charging $30 a ton.
Yeah, in British Columbia has the highest carbon tax in the country, and that's $30 a ton. And as far as Alberta, I think it's going to be $20 to $30 a ton. They're phasing in a carbon tax. Right now they have a bit of a system where people who are large emitters, over 100,000 tons, I believe, a year, they have to gradually lower their emissions, and they have to pay into a fund if they're not able to do that. And they can also purchase credits. It's a bit complicated, but in 2018, Alberta is actually phasing in a more global carbon tax that might cover as much as 90% of their economy.
And the BC carbon tax, it's now at $30 a ton, and everybody's paying. Consumers are paying at the pump. Homeowners are paying in their gas bills based on calculations of how much CO2 is associated with burning your furnace or whatever, and industry's paying. In other words, everybody, it's distributed. Is this right?
I'm not positive, but I don't think it's completely distributed, because I know British Columbia and other jurisdictions do this as well. There's certain industries that are very emissions intense and are also very competitive globally, have to be competitive, like the oil and gas sector. So under these schemes, often governments will exempt certain big polluters from this. And Ontario actually is a developing story, but they're not a carbon tax situation. But anyways, in BC, there are people that are exempt, but there are also efforts in place to sort of mitigate the effects on lower income people. I don't know exactly what these efforts are. So because
and the BC economy has been growing all the while with a carbon tax in place.
Well, all I can say is that the carbon tax has actually not been creating a greater burden for people price-wise, because what they're doing is they're following a strategy called making it revenue neutral. So any money that the government brings in from the carbon tax, they actually give back to businesses and consumers in the form of tax cuts in other areas. So in the end, their budget is balanced. And
so it's tax shifting.
It's tax shifting, yeah. Whereas in other jurisdictions, something a little bit more controversial is that the government takes in money, whether from a carbon tax or whether from cap and trade auctions, which we can talk about later. They take in that money and they use it for a specific fund to fund green projects, such as green infrastructure. And that's sort of government earmarking the money instead of giving it back to people.
And so this is the idea with the carbon tax, that it's going to be important to use the funds that are raised to actually plow into alternative technologies and means to make energy production more renewable.
Well, that's part of the idea that governments have. But you can argue that by putting a price on carbon, what you're doing is you're sending an economic signal. You're saying it's going to be more expensive to do things that pollute. So therefore, there's a natural, businesses have self-interest. They want to save money, and consumers as well. So they're going to naturally gravitate towards lower carbon forms of energy and so on. So the idea is you shouldn't have to have all this money going specifically to green programs to make that shift happen. It should happen as the result of prices and supply and demand. But the issue is that as you move towards a green economy, you also need a green infrastructure. Just like we needed to build roads and highways to support car culture, we're going to need to build technologies to support a low-carbon economy. So the argument can be made that it's important to put money into that, and that's what a green fund can be used for. But some have suggested that politicians aren't equipped to decide specific green energy development projects that deserve their money. So they've said, oh, well, in Ontario, which is going to be making money from the auction of pollution permits under cap and trade, they're saying, well, the politicians aren't equipped to know like which projects they should be giving money to. Let the people have this money so they can spend it the way they see fit.
And when you say people, you're talking about industry. Tell me about cap and trade. Like, what's the difference between cap and trade and a carbon tax? Quickly, if you can.
Sure, yeah. Well, the system under cap and trade is this idea that the government decides that there's a total limit on how much pollution is going to be allowed, how much carbon can be emitted across the entire province, for example. And that's the cap. And under that system, every different industry has every business, for example, has his own individual limit. And if a business goes under, it doesn't actually need release that much pollution. It has basically a credit. It has leftover leftover allowances. If another business is finding that it's not able to go under its cap, it can actually purchase these pollution allowances from other businesses that aren't using theirs. So then that's the trade aspect.
And then you crank down the cap.
Well, exactly. Over time, the cap goes gradually lower and lower and lower. And the cool thing about cap and trade versus carbon tax is that it actually allows you to actually know how much total pollution is being produced and actually set your target and set your amounts, so you can say overall it's going to go down by X percent in this period of time. Like, the government knows this. Whereas if you talk about a carbon tax, you don't know that. It's just putting a price on carbon. So there's no guarantee that the numbers are going to go down by an absolute percentage. So that the advantage of cap and trade basically is it can be very aggressive. And that's important when we're looking at meeting goals. Like, for example, the previous government committed to reducing emissions levels from 2005 to 2030 by 30%. And right now, Trudeau, at the First Minister's meeting in Vancouver, was saying that we're going to be exceeding that by 50% by the time 2030 rolls around if we don't change things.
Thank you so very much for explaining this complex topic with me, Sara. We'll have to talk about it again later.
Yeah, of course. You're welcome.
Have another go at it.
For sure.
You've been watching Fast Forward Newsline. A fresh edition comes your way inside this little box here at Green Planet Monitor, this time each week, thanks to the Government of Canada and the Social Justice Fund of Unifor for their generous support. You can be a sponsor of the Fast Forward Newsline. Send us a note at greenplanetmonitor.net. My name is Dave Kattenberg. Bye for now.